Hello and welcome back. Now that you're here, we can get back to the discussion of the Jujutsu Kaisen power system. This time we will be covering a large topic, making up the vast majority of abilities showcased throughout the entire series. That topic is of course, cursed techniques. We're going to touch on practically every aspect of cursed techniques, starting with the basic definitions and then delving deeper into obscure knowledge from fan books and one-off abilities. So without further delay, let's get ready for a long one. Cursed techniques are the most fundamental expression of Jujutsu Sorcery. Essentially, any use of Jujutsu beyond basic manipulation of cursed energy, like body reinforcement, can be considered a technique of some kind. Cursed techniques, by consequence, become a sweeping umbrella term, so we'll work to break it down into segments for easier digestion. But before we discuss the different types of cursed techniques, I believe it's important that we don't overlook some basic information that lots of us don't even think about anymore. Cursed techniques are fueled by cursed energy, which is a power source spawned from the negative emotions of human beings. Cursed users and sorcerers intentionally generate and manipulate massive quantities of cursed energy in order to fuel their techniques and enhance their physical capabilities. There is a distinction between negative energy and cursed energy according to the fan book. Negative energy stems directly from the emotions and swells in the stomach or core, and cursed energy is created by the forward rotation of negative energy circulating throughout the body, essentially processing and purifying it into a more applicable power. The concept of forward rotation is represented by the term lapse that you might recognize from Gojo's blue technique. It is a vital process of the use of Jujutsu on many levels, but we'll get into that after we classify the two main types of curse techniques. There are two types of curse techniques, with further subtypes among them: innate and non-innate. An innate technique is an inborn characteristic of the brain which is usually unique to a person or family and determines about 80% of a cursed user's potential. These abilities are nearly impossible to mimic and are so ingrained into the user that they exhibit extreme difficulty trying to manipulate cursed energy on a basic level without their technique, according to Higuruma. Non-innate techniques are manipulations of generic Jujutsu Sorcery and cursed energy that don't require a user to be born with innate curse techniques to function, and can be taught to anyone with the baseline energy to see curses. Shikigami and barrier techniques are the most obvious examples. However, even reverse curse technique doesn't seem to require an innate technique, as evidenced by Shoko. Entire schools of Jujutsu have been crafted in service of non-innate techniques, like the new Shadow style, for instance. When cursed techniques of any kind are used, they will always leave behind energy residuals that can be used to trace the caster. Depending on the intensity of the residual left behind, it may be extremely difficult for anyone to notice if they aren't diligent in their investigation. Innate techniques are extensions of the mind space within all sorcerers, known as the innate domain, which serves as the foundation of all cursed techniques. It is important to note that every sentient being has an innate domain, but in order to use an innate technique, one needs to be born with a specific base level of innate talent. This is why Yuji can use domain expansion despite being born without a technique. Within the right frontal cortex of the human brain, there is a figurative black box that no one fully understands. Within this black box is a sorcerer's innate technique, which has been slowly engraved into their brain over the course of their entire life, and usually manifests halfway through the first decade of the sorcerer's life. Barring awakened sorcerers who have their brain manipulated to become able to express their innate domain when they normally wouldn't have been able to use an innate technique. It has been made clear that cursed spirits have some equivalent to a human brain based on their weakness to Gojo's unlimited void domain expansion and their ability to wield cursed techniques, but they are far more resistant to the brain damage of Gojo's domain than even cursed objects like Sukuna. Innate cursed techniques make up the majority of the power system, so naturally they add diversity to fights and avoid stale battles. There are a massive number of ways that one's technique can be expressed. For example, Yuji has the same technique as Sukuna due to containing his essence for a prolonged period of time and his innate connection to him. However, his expression of the shrine technique is far better suited for damaging the soul and is more commonly used to disrupt the terrain. This shows us that even the abilities of cursed techniques are determined based on the user's interpretation and personality. To further diversify techniques in Jujutsu battles, innate techniques are then further divided into types, namely lapse, neutral, reversal, extension, and maximum techniques, and possibly hollow. In the case of a hollow technique, it is unclear if it's just a special type of extension technique or an entire subset of Jujutsu in and of itself, due to us only seeing it in one case. The official Jujutsu Kaisen fanbook describes the process of activating a curse technique as the forward rotation of negative energy, which then manifests as cursed energy, which then further rotates forward to be poured into the technique engraved within the sorcerer's brain. In order to better visualize this process, picture Megumi facing right on a piece of paper in the middle of a clock. The standard activation of a technique can be visualized as a clockwise rotation beginning from the 3 position, or the core, where negative energy is born, and then rotating through his body until it reaches the 12 position, or more plainly, his brain. And finally, once the energy reaches his engraved 10 shadows technique, it is then shot out, completing the cycle, exiting him and traveling outwards with the 1 and 2 positions. This process has been translated to lapse by Viz manga adaptation in the anime, but it essentially means the standard use of a technique as opposed to the neutral usage, reversal, extension, and maximum variants of the technique, as seen by Gojo's Infinity, Red, and Hollow Purple techniques, as well as Geto's Uzumaki, shown in Jujutsu Kaisen 0. On the topic of Gojo, his curse technique is unique not just in its spatial manipulation nature, but also in how it has been expressed throughout the show. More specifically, Gojo's technique is somewhat unique in 2 notable ways. First, his limitless technique has a neutral ability called Infinity that operates without the reinforcement or rotation of positive or cursed energy. We know this because otherwise it would be classified as his lapse technique, but instead, his blue technique is directly called lapse and consistently described as Infinity strengthened by cursed energy, which is noteworthy because all cursed techniques are meant to already be strengthened by cursed energy, except for reversals, which are strengthened by positive energy, which we'll briefly touch on once we're done discussing Gojo. It should be noted that Gojo's neutral Infinity can be boosted to resist being negated and crush things, as we see in Gojo's battle against the disaster curses in Shibuya, but this process is not to be confused with the cursed energy rotation associated with lapse techniques. In this case, that would be represented by Gojo's blue. The second way that Gojo's technique is unique is that it benefits from a special type of extension technique that combines both the negative and positive versions of the empowered Infinity to create what is called a hollow technique, also known as imaginary technique, purple. No other technique has been shown to have hollow applications, despite many other characters being able to manipulate positive energy or use curse technique reversals. When a typical technique lapse or rotation is fueled by positive energy instead of negative cursed energy, the result is a reversal technique that is considerably more powerful, and its effect is typically inverted. For example, Kenjaku's technique allows him to reduce the strength of gravity around him, and its reversal violently magnifies gravity instead. For more information on this process and positive energy in general, check out my video on the topic, link in the description. Now that we've established the most and least common applications of Jujutsu, let's discuss perhaps the most expressive and interesting form a curse technique can take. The most common expression of an innate technique beyond its basic application or lapse is called an extension technique. While it is impossible to change an innate technique, a sorcerer can still broaden their interpretation of the technique and create their own unique sub-technique by applying the innate technique in an intentional way to achieve a new result. For example, Nanami's ratio technique thrives when attacking a single point or target, but by altering his cursed energy output and targeting the terrain, he can create a shockwave, effectively attacking a wide range and creating cursed energy-infused shrapnel at the same time. This alteration of his normal ratio technique is an extension technique called ratio collapse. Similarly, Megumi is able to use the lapse of his innate 10 shadows technique to summon Shikigami. He does this by making specific hand seals at the time of pouring energy into his technique, and the hand seals each correspond to a specific shadow, but by making the signs for 2 shadows at once, he can summon an amalgam creature with a fragment of its parent's power, but none of the risk associated with fully manifesting a shadow on its own. More generalized techniques like shadow manipulation Kenshin or Mekamaru's puppet technique are more prone to extension techniques than more focused abilities like ratio. Some extension techniques are a logical extension of the base technique's premise, and others are completely separate from their typical use, although these are rare. For example, Jogo's technique allows him to manipulate fire and other volcanic concepts, but in his first battle against Gojo, he uses an extension technique to create insects from his head that make sound-based attacks, completely straying from his technique's typical gimmick. Finally, we reach the greatest expression of an innate technique without the use of domain expansion. Every technique has an ultimate move known in the Jujutsu Kaisen verse as a maximum technique, not to be confused with using any other technique at maximum cursed energy output. Those techniques are called stack abilities according to the fanbook. A maximum technique is the most supreme art and can take many different shapes depending on the technique, but typically these techniques take the form of flashy finishing moves, as evidenced by 2 of the 3 of them being massive attacks of explosive power, namely Geto's Uzumaki and Jogo's Meteor. Maximum techniques aren't exclusively for attack power, however. Geto's Uzumaki also allows him to extract the cursed techniques of his high-level spirits and use them once each, whereas Esso's Wing King vastly amps his agility and speed, in addition to giving him a variety of angles to attack opponents with. It is implied that these techniques require great talent and cursed energy reserves to learn and activate, although it's never been directly stated that any of these 3 users were particularly drained after their use. Another interesting note, maximum techniques are said to be the predetermined ultimate move of an innate technique, but we do see that Kenjaku was able to manipulate the properties of Geto's maximum technique in order to use it much quicker and with a considerable bonus to precision against Yuki Tsukumo. This is oftentimes called a minimum technique by the fanbase due to its small size, but beyond its literal effects, it implies that they are similar to extension techniques in the sense that even maximum techniques can be adapted to suit the needs of the caster. As a matter of fact, within the same battle, Choso was able to create a smaller and weaker version of his brother's Wing King maximum technique, so it isn't a complete outlier within the context of the series. Moving past standard usage of a technique's many expressions, it can also be imbued within the confines of a barrier to manifest the caster's innate domain within the pocket dimension of the barrier, or the real world in rare cases. Within this innate domain, the technique is guaranteed to hit or properly activate in the case of non-conventional attacks. Essentially, reality warps to accommodate the technique, and in some cases boosting its power to 120%, and this results in the ability being nearly impossible to avoid. This process is explained in further detail in my domain expansion video, linked in the description. Now that we've covered the basics of innate techniques, we can begin to go over non-innate curse techniques to paint a fuller picture of what the term curse technique actually encompasses. Non-innate techniques are expressions of Jujutsu that don't require an engraved technique or any innate ability, besides the talent to manipulate cursed energy. It is important to note that even those without techniques have innate domains, which serve as the basis for barrier techniques. Barrier techniques involve the creation of structures using cursed energy, which can be refined to include a variety of abilities or rules, for example. The most common and basic barrier technique is called a curtain or veil, and its purpose is to prevent non-sorcerers from discovering the use of Jujutsu or the existence of cursed spirits, which can become visible to normal people when they are near death or in areas with massive amounts of cursed energy, typically due to being actively haunted. Veils also force the cursed spirits to show themselves, which makes the use of a veil essential standard practice for Jujutsu sorcerers. Jujutsu sorcery barriers will also typically disrupt radio communications in similar wavelengths from piercing through the barrier. Barriers are formed by the caster creating a formula from scratch within their mind, which determines things like size, shape, range, and any specific rules, such as preventing Satoru Gojo from coming or going throughout the barrier, as we see in this Kyoto Sister Exchange event. As the details of the formula become more complex, the casting process matches its complexity exponentially. So typically those with average experience or aptitude will stick to simple barriers, such such as curtains or basic barriers that even characters like Ichiji are capable of. These barriers can become very powerful when cast by the right sorcerer. For example, Kenjaku and Tengen are capable of casting hundreds of complex barriers that force certain rules upon their inhabitants, protecting, concealing, and trapping hundreds or thousands of locations and people at a time. There are many different types of barriers. Tengen uses empty barriers that serve as blank canvases that anyone on his level as a barrier user can manipulate at will. Tengen also employs highly advanced barriers called pure barriers that suppress cursed spirits and empower the barriers of Jujutsu assistant managers like Ichiji, as well as funnel curses into specific locations that better allow for sorcerers to contain and exercise them. These barriers are located around the Imperial Palace, the Tombs of the Star, the Yamakuni Mausoleum, and Mount Hida. These 4 barriers are considered essential for the Jujutsu world, and the rampage of curses would be nearly impossible to contain without them. Using these pure barriers as a foundation, Kenjaku was able to create an even more refined and powerful barrier called a Bon barrier, which contained a powerful and complex enough formula to subject nearly all of Japan to the rules of the culling games, and it has the ability to remotely activate Mahito's soul manipulation technique to kill those who fail to adhere to the rules of the game. Barriers can be used to form or counteract a domain expansion as well, although it should be noted that domains can be created or countered without the involvement of barriers altogether. Although these concepts will not be discussed in greater detail here, as they already have been in my domain and anti-domain videos respectively, which are also linked in the description. Finally, the last component of non-innate techniques are Shikigami, folkloric constructs of cursed energy, not to be confused with negative energy beings known as cursed spirits. Using a pre-prepared talisman or Buddhist paper seal as a medium, any cursed user can channel cursed energy into their medium and summon a Shikigami, which must be tamed, typically via combat, before they can be used for the caster's benefit. Shikigami can be used to track curses and residuals, fight, or perform other simple tasks on behalf of their summoner, as ordered, before they eventually disappear due to their summoner releasing the technique or losing consciousness. While it is true that Shikigami are one of the 3 basic uses of cursed energy, along with barriers and body reinforcement, they are still heavily linked to some innate techniques, such as Megumi's 10 Shadows and Junpei's Moondrag's techniques. These techniques allow for specific Shikigami to be summoned without the use of a seal or talisman, and instead substitute them with shadows in Megumi's case. This makes their use far more flexible, and typically the most powerful Shikigami are associated with innate techniques. The previously mentioned seals can also be used for a variety of other purposes according to the fanbook, such as sealing objects and curses, as well as activating pre-programmed barrier techniques. In conclusion, curse techniques make up practically all of the Versus power system except basic hand-to-hand combat and body enhancement, so the sorcery aspect of Sorcery Fight can be attributed to curse techniques solely, which separates Jujutsu sorcerers from martial artist monks. This rich power system includes so many potential twists that it's hard to confine a character to a single ability, even though each character has only one innate technique that grants them a strong personal identity. Whereas other anime would stop at that ability, Jujutsu Kaisen allows for the characters and audience's imaginations to run wild with the possibilities about potential uses and interpretations for all kinds of techniques that reinforce the premise that Jujutsu is only limited by the imagination and talent of its wielder. Thanks for watching. I can already tell while scripting this that it's almost definitely going to be one of my longest videos to date, but I'm excited to be wrapping up the majority of the basics for the JJK power system. Let me know what other concepts you'd like me to go over in the future. But either way, I hope you stay safe and take it easy.